best way to stay healthy is by making sure you're putting the right things in your body, which is easier said than done when you're trying to figure out the right diet and supplements to take. Good news. Cardimax Immune Booster has you covered. Right now, American Party Podcast listeners get 30% off your next 4 orders. Use the promo code American at cardimax.com. That's CARDOMAX.com, helping you achieve your max. Boom. Capitalism. We can talk about some of that today with our guest, Mr. Alec Ross. How should I introduce you exactly? Like, what do you, if you were introducing yourself for the first time and somebody said, what do you do? Tell me what you do.
All right. Right now I'm selling a book, man. So I say he's the author. He's the author of the new book, The Raging 2020s.
Yeah. It's good. I really enjoyed it. Our audience is pretty, I would say they lean pretty conservative and libertarian. Maybe more so libertarian now than anything, because conservatism has been kind of,
I don't know what that means anymore.
I don't either. It's been
I don't know what conservatism means anymore. What it meant when Ronald Reagan was president was one thing that is completely different than today. So you're gonna have to explain that term to me.
Yeah, I don't know the definition of it either anymore. I mean, to be honest, I'm not sure I would categorize Reagan as a conservative either. Taxes were raised 5 out of 8 times. The national debt tripled, right, under his administration. So,
although the 1986 Tax Act, which was his sort of signature tax deal, massively lowered the top rate for individual taxes.
That's true.
I mean,
yeah.
it was a different time. It was a different time.
Yeah, for sure. So this book, The Raging 2020s, obviously is a callback to the Roaring 20s of the 1920s and a period where post-World War I, things got a little crazy, right?
They did.
We took some pretty big economic risk in a time when I'll categorize it this way: Brett Weinstein and his wife Heather discuss in a lot of their books about safety nets, not social safety nets as we see them, but like parental safety nets when they're talking about parenting, and how kids who feel secure that their parents are protecting them are more likely to take risk. And that makes sense, right? That's how things work. But when you take risk in a volatile environment, that seems like a bad idea. And we're doing a lot of that these days, aren't we?
We are. No, look, the world has entered a period of volatility that would have been hard to predict a while back. It's sort of a roller coaster. And to take risks, I mean, look, if you're in a position of relative privilege, you've got a lot better ability to take risks than people who, if they don't get that direct deposit into their checking account every 2 weeks, they're fucked. So
yeah. I mean, I wonder what percentage of Americans right now are working paycheck to paycheck. And I don't know if that's even a relevant question anymore, because so many people have left the workforce. We've seen mass quittings and things like that, and stimulus checks and so on and so forth. I wonder. It's hard for me in my position right now to understand what's happening on the ground, so to speak, economically for people.
It's a strange time. I mean, look, I grew up in, I'm a public school kid from the hills of West Virginia. Mm-hmm. And, when I was growing up, there was this thing it's not called this anymore, welfare. Mm-hmm. And, look, welfare was sort of a safety net, but those of us who actually grew up in West Virginia and the hills also saw how it created a dependency. And people were like, well, if I'm going to get 70% of what I'd get, if I'm going to get 70% sitting on the porch of what I'd get working 40 hours a week, I'm going to sit on the porch. And so I think we're in a weird period right now, and there's a lot to it where a lot of people are sitting on the porch as opposed to going back to work, because we've created incentives for people to not go back to work. The private sector is responding to this, but it is an interesting period of transition. Just like you said earlier, Dan, the Roaring 20s were an interesting period of transition.
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly, and there's something, I mean, that would be the default conservative position, that people have no motivation to go back to work. I think that's probably reductive, right? I mean, no problem is ever encapsulated by a single idea like that. There's a lot of stuff going on. Wage stagnation.
No, there's a lot of complexity. When you don't, like you just said, wage stagnation, if wages stay flat, people aren't necessarily going to want to go back and work their asses off.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's so, as I said, a great portion of our audience is whatever conservatism means, or probably more libertarian now. So I know they don't like discussions of minimum wages because it's a government mandate of some sort. And frankly, I don't really like the idea that that might need to exist either. But this isn't about government mandates for me. It's about holding corporations responsible. So it's about stakeholder capital, really, is what it's about, right? Instead of shareholder capital, which is something you talk about in the book, and something I believe you've spoken about in some of your previous books as well, and certainly in a lot of your interviews. I feel like this idea that corporations can't do wrong is something that's existed in the job creator, right? As I think Frank Luntz came up with that one. He's a good guy at coming up with bullshit like that.
He's a genius at coming up with the perfect 3 words.
Yeah, he really is. But it's we see with corporatism. So all the things that conservatives hate about the pharmaceutical industry is what everybody else hates about corporatism in general, right? It's the same thing. It's profits over people, and that's something that becomes untenable in any economy over time. So I wonder. I always find that the farther down the rabbit hole you go on these issues, and the deeper you dig, the more in common the people who have been fucked over are, and the less in common they are with people who are doing the fucking over, which seems to be a small group of people.
Yeah, man. Look, I'm in violent agreement with you, and I see this sort of through 2 eyes. So, again, growing up in West Virginia, I worked on a beer truck, and I worked as a midnight janitor for minimum wage, by the way. Now I live in the world of capital, and so I see in the world of capital, it's sort of heads I win, tails you lose. When you're living in the world of capital, you are manipulating the world of labor. The world, the people who are working are basically subservient to your ability to build capital. And the problem, I'm a capitalist, but the problem is our capitalism is extremely fucked up right now. We've gone, you just said it.
I mean, it's corporatism. It's not capitalism, right?
Yeah, no. In many respects, it's corporate socialism. So when I think, for example, like about the airlines, all right? Like when the 5 big American airlines produce $49 billion in profits over 10 years, and they use $47 billion of that to do share buybacks and push up the share price.
Right.
And then when trouble hits, the taxpayers bail them out. Like, that's not capitalism, that's corporate socialism,
right,
where we privatize the profits to a small number of shareholders and we socialize the costs to the taxpayers. So it's corporatism, it's shareholder capitalism. It's not the kind of capitalism that enabled us to rise after World War II to economic greatness.
Yeah, we couldn't, after World War II, we couldn't allow for that. There were certain programs like the GI Bill, the VA-backed home loan specifically, that educated the middle class for the first time and gave them the pathway to ownership of a mortgage, which is the way that most middle class build wealth in their lifetime, right? So those programs had to be universal, for lack of a better phrase. They weren't universal because they didn't apply. Although they did apply to black people, segregation was still a thing. So a college could say, hey, I see your GI Bill and raise you, fuck off, right? I raise you Jim Crow. So that's why HBCUs were important then. And people seem to lose sight of that. But I think that you're definitely right about a lot of this stuff from my perspective. And I think it's something that a lot of our folks would probably agree with. When they see companies like General Electric and Facebook and Google and Starbucks not paying any taxes, right? It's some severe combination of cognitive dissonance and mental gymnastics to arrive at the conclusion that that's okay, right? And I think people have been, just because we've been polarized into the left and right so much, you follow these 7 bullet points, so you must be conservative, so you have to defend anything that identifies itself as such. That's absolute nonsense. And the way these corporations have evaded taxes is absolute nonsense, right?
Look, when a single one FedEx driver pays more in federal taxes than Federal Express Corporation, that is completely fucked up. And I don't care if you're left, if you're right. I mean, that's not about left versus right. That's about up versus down. You know, when some 17-year-old who makes your coffee in the morning at Starbucks pays more in federal taxes out of their minimum wage salary than Starbucks Corporation does, that's not about left versus right. That's about up versus down.
Right.
And part of what the stories that I try to tell in this book, The Raging 20s, is to unpack this, because tax policy is really fucking complicated and really boring.
Intentionally so, though, right?
Exactly. Look, this is why it's designed. This is why these guys win.
I mean, tax policy right now in Western culture mirrors the illiteracy of the pre-industrial age, which is you're kept illiterate, so you don't know any better, so you can't form your own businesses or do whatever the fuck else, right? It is a form of exclusionary politics. And if you're able to earn on your capital and evade taxes like that, then you can do stuff relatively easily that other people just don't have the ability to do, right?
No, look, the richest guy I know, I was on his boat, and we were in the water. And I consider, look, I think I'm no genius, but I consider myself relatively well-educated. And I looked at the flag on his boat. It wasn't an American flag. It wasn't that flag behind you there, Dan. Mm. I'm like, what flag is that on the boat? And he gave me the name of some pissant Caribbean island. And he's like, yeah, this boat is flagged to this island. He goes, I've turned this boat, which cost millions of bucks, by the way, into something profitable. Like, he literally turned his party boat into a profit center because he had the army of lawyers and accountants, which normal people can't hire, these super fancy lawyers and accountants. So that if he wants to buy a multi-million-dollar boat, not only it becomes profitable because they've got the army of lawyers and accountants that know how to take this incredibly boring stuff and turn it into something that works for the rich guy.
Right, and it's a system kind of akin to just the political infrastructure. I would call it the American aristocracy, where these political campaigns cannot be run without those contributions. They can't exist. And I would also call into question, I mean, I'll get into this a little bit later, but some of the companies that members of Congress invest in more than others are truly disturbing, especially these days, and the behavior that they engage in on a regular basis. But we'll get to that later. I wanted to ask you about some others. You've I would guess that politically, you and members of our audience probably disagree on quite a bit of stuff, which is, that's good. It's a good thing because
when two people agree about everything, only one person is doing the thinking.
Yeah,
and
exactly,
and your audience is thoughtful. I try to be thoughtful.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, there are going to be things we agree about, and there are going to be things that we disagree about.
Yeah, for sure. And I've listened to a lot of your interviews. I've read one full book, and I've read about half of another one. And you're generally pretty intellectually honest about things that are in front of you. So I appreciate that, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show. So I want to ask you about that. Sounds like a setup, doesn't it?
It does. I'm ready.
No, it's not.
It's all good, man.
I like the idea. Like for a decade now, I've been trying to convince conservatives and libertarians that the government can be useful in a lot of ways if it does what the fuck it's supposed to do, which is to stay out of the way for the most part and be a safety net for safety, for health, and for military defense and for infrastructure, right? That's really the only thing it should be doing. All this other stuff is superfluous. And the government has become so I guess, entrenched in the superfluous that people now see it as a cancer. And maybe they're right. I don't know. But going back to the tax thing and the way it's set up to benefit a small group of people, I'm fine with distributing more of the tax burden to corporations. I'm definitely fine with limiting their power, both economically and politically. This corporations are people, my friend. Shit, Mitt Romney needs to go fuck himself with all that, right? I mean, it's the collective will of people is a good thing. The collective money and power of an aristocracy is crippling to an economy and to liberty itself. So I wonder, from your perspective, the answer to this question. To me, it's very troubling that this conversation that happens between the left and right very frequently, people like you, who I would say are probably a little bit farther left economically, and you're certainly, as I said, very intellectually honest about these things. Why doesn't this conversation include the fact that the government is spending too much money? Like it's the premise. So I can set the bar here. The premise seems to be that we need X amount of dollars, and more of it should come from rich people and corporations. But I reject that premise. I think we need way less money than we're spending. We certainly didn't need to spend trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? I think everybody would agree on that.
Well, look, so to the premise of your question, I agree with it. The government, and I write about this in the Raging 2020s, government has become so big and so complex that we can't even do modest-sized things anymore. So 100 years ago, we were building these incredible, beautiful bridges. We were building subway systems. 70 years ago, we built a highway system. Now, if you want to add a lane to a highway, they're like, oh, that's going to take 4 years and cost billions of dollars. So the work of government has become so complicated and so larded down with layers and bureaucracy and bullshit that it can no longer produce a public good. And when you can no longer produce a public good, you lose the faith of the governed. And you pointed out that there are things that government has to do. Look, if we are going to defend ourselves as a country, we have to have a military. We are not going to have a privatized military. That's not the way this stuff works. But the problem is that government has become so complicated, and there's this other part, which is political polarization. So there's a reason why in this book there are words that are banned. There are words that I refuse to write. The word Trump, Obama, Clinton, Biden, McConnell, those words don't appear in the book. Yeah. Because as soon as you say any of those words, smart people get stupid.
Yeah,
right?
For sure, yeah.
As soon as you say those words, smart people get stupid. And we start thinking about solutions. And so to your point about government being too big, we've got Democrats supporting one half of things. We got Republicans supporting the other half of things, and it all stays put.
Yeah, for sure. It used to be the conversation was Republicans were dragging Democrats towards smaller government, and then vice versa, right? The Democrats wanted to spend more money on social programs and such. Now it seems like, it's not seems like, since at least since Bush 2, George W., I don't know why I keep having to make this point, but he presided over the largest expansion of the federal government in the history of this country. You know what I mean? And since then, every president has taken on more and more debt. We've had to, right? I guess. And it's not true to say we've had to. There is another option. It's very uncomfortable, and people are not willing to do it, clearly. Now the conversation, like you said, is more over, I'm going to get mine. I think it's kind of it's a Maslow's thing. Everybody has lost this hierarchy of needs being fulfilled from whatever it is, from society itself, maybe from government to some degree as well. And people are just like, well, I'm going to get mine now. Everybody else is doing it. I'm going to fucking do it too. And that's cultural decay, right? Like there's no principles anymore. We just kind of operate based on it's almost like a social paycheck to paycheck, right? Not financial.
Yeah. Now, look, Dan, you understand history well, and so you'll know this isn't the first time this has happened. Oh, I mean, this is what happens at the end of all great empires past, right? It's like a party that's gone on too long, and people have eaten way too much, and they won't stop eating. Right. And the gluttony, everybody ends up dead and on the floor. What we have to do is, unless we want this to be the end of the American empire, we have to change our behavior. And you're right. If this is just math, like these aren't actually what you just said actually isn't an opinion. It's just math. It's not even calculus. It's like high school math. Yeah. I mean, the last time it's been since the 1990s that we had a surplus. Ever since then, we've had a massive increase in government spending. We're now up to nearly $30 trillion in national debt. we're breaking every barrier that we used to think existed, and the bill's gonna come due. The bill's gonna come due, and the question, look, we can either raise more money, and part of where I say I want to raise the money is from corporations and from the richest people in America. But ultimately, to make this most sustainable, everybody's got to give something back, right? Like, we can't have both Democrats getting everything they want and Republicans getting everything they want, and then just figuring out how we're going to pay for all of it. People got to look at I bet 95% of the people listening to us right now don't just buy whatever the fuck they want. Like, they make choices.
Yeah. I mean, that goes down to that goes down to the evolutionary level. Like, every new feature you create in evolution through random mutation, you pay a price for, right? Like, if my eyesight gets better, my ability to run faster might decrease in some, because there's only a certain amount of energy to do these things. And it's the same way with finance, right? Regardless of how wealthy you are, you're paying some price. Now, the price might not be dollars for you at that point, but there's some social price to be paid for indulging yourself on every single thing. And Eastern religion figured that shit out 6,000 years ago. You know what I mean? This is nothing new. I would say to your point about we need to get more to do this, to deal with these issues. I think about a bucket with holes in it. We're pouring water into it, and right now America is focused on the source of the water, and we're not plugging any of the holes. And a rational society would say, why is all this leaking out? And they would fix the bucket first, and then start worrying about, where the water is coming from. And because, let's be honest, every time either side, right or left, passes, whether it's a tax cut from the right or a tax increase from the left, or if it's Obamacare from the left or something else or insurance from the right, it is the middle class that bears the brunt, because wealthier people have better attorneys. That's it. They're able to navigate this horse shit better. I mean, I think my effective tax rate is like 15, 16% at my current income level, which is way lower than most people, I would guess. Unless you're like $18,000 or less income, which is poverty, right?
So look, we're in the same position. It's weird. And I think look, again, a public school kid from the hills of West Virginia. So I saw it from the other side.
Yeah, I'm a public school kid from Greenville, South Carolina. So
there you go. But what we have in common is we're now seeing it from the other side. And so what's weird to me, again, is like, I spend a year writing this book, and I bet my effective tax rate, because I now have the fancy lawyers and accountants who, I'm like, I'm not breaking the law. Like, I will not break the law. Everything we're doing is legal. Right. But my tax rate, I bet, is lower than the 23-year-old research assistant who worked for me.
They're probably paying somewhere around 23, 24% effective, and you're probably somewhere between 13 and 16% effective if you're doing it right. And it is what it is. I mean, I'd like to challenge the idea, though, about capital gains. I've heard you comment about a lot. And it's not like I feel the same way as you do. I just like to challenge my beliefs. And the reason I feel the way you do is because I know what I have, and I know that I can give more. So I think the question we should be asking, and it's the same thing I've been talking about this whole time, is we keep thinking about who can do this and not whether any of us should. Like, why should we continue funding this government? Why should we continue giving them money to go fight these stupid fucking wars, or to fund other countries, or to fund their bullshit? You know what I mean? In general, all the pork and nonsense that happens, all the favors they have to do to lobbyists to get elected. Why would we continue to give ice cream to this self-licking ice cream cone?
No, it's very strange to me that, and look, I saw it when I was working at the State Department. We'd go to Iraq, and there'd be a brand new nice school that we built. And in the meantime, my kids, I've got 3 kids, are in an overcrowded classroom with 36, 37 kids in a class. In the middle of winter, they have to wear their winter coats because the heating doesn't work. And I'm just like, how is it that we're building a school in some random province in Iraq, and my kids in Baltimore are in these clap traps? And so what happens, so you brought up the aristocracy earlier. The aristocracy has self-selected out of this world.
Yeah.
because they go to private schools. They don't feel it. And this goes back to another point of yours, Dan, where you were talking about stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism. In a world of stakeholder capitalism, if you remember when we were growing up, every town in the United States that's sort of medium-sized or bigger had a headquarters for some company. And headquarters for companies were all over America. And the kids of the CEO went to the same school as the kids of the middle management, and they supported the Little League, they supported the arts, the United Way. They were part of a broader community. But when we went from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism, and it's like, all right, every headquarters is now going to be in these tax-optimized locations in Delaware or somewhere else, and the kids of the CEO are not going into that classroom. They don't care if we're paying for classrooms in Iraq and not paying for classrooms back home because they don't know any better. Their kids are going to private schools.
Right.
So the aristocracy has created a parallel reality in the United States right now. We've always had aristocrats, but we've never had the kind of parallel reality that's as big as it is now.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And from the perspective of, I think one of the things you mentioned in the book is what we fundamentally lack is leadership, right? We lack men and women of actual principle, not the Pelosi's of the world whose husband is insider trading all over the place, not the Trumps who are just fanning their own ego for the most part, in my opinion. We lack people of principle who are willing to sacrifice and take negative press and deal with what reality is instead of pretending like all this stuff doesn't exist. And it permeates our entire culture because it's come from the top down. It is our leaders in business. Now there are good folks as well. I would say Bill Foley, the guy who owned, or still, I guess he still owns Fidelity Insurance. He owns the Vegas Golden Knights. He was a former Air Force JAG officer, and he just borrowed money from his family actually to buy Fidelity Insurance in like 1983. But within a decade, he had set up a program where 10% of the equity in that company was set aside for the employees. And if there is any kind of equity event, whether it's a sale or investment or whatever, that came into play, right? They had equity in the company, and he expanded it beyond there. Once a week, people would come wash their cars for free, right? They would give them haircuts, whatever the fuck they wanted. He was one of the first people to introduce childcare into corporate America, but that is not the standard. Not by a fucking wide margin. It is shareholder capitalism. For our audience who doesn't know what that phrase means, it means that I'm going to maximize profits, and I don't give a fuck what the outcome is after that.
Yeah. So look, you've got a big military audience, and let's throw some numbers out there. I want you to guess, if you don't mind doing this exercise with me. I want you to guess the percentage of CEOs in 1980 that had some military service in their background, all right? And then I want you to guess the percentage of veterans in 2021 who have some military service in their background.
I would guess, just based on population numbers, 16% of the military served, or 16% of the male population served in World War II, so probably around 15% of CEOs then, and I think it's about 0.45% today, so it's probably around 0.5%.
Yeah, so it was 58%.
Holy shit.
In 1980. 58%. So if you are in the, look, you know this better than anybody. People who are listening better than anybody. There is no more of a stakeholder mentality than military service. If you are in the military and you are only optimizing for yourself, right, and you don't give a shit about the person to your left or your right, you are dead.
Yeah.
You're dead. So think about
it's the ultimate meritocracy, right? Right. Life and death is the ultimate meritocracy. You will either figure out the right way to do shit or you will be gone.
So 35 years after the end of World War II, we had this peak of CEOs in America who had military service, 58%. Now we're under 5%. And so it's interesting, the concept of service to a community, to, folks we're working with, has depreciated as a function of our going from this stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism. But there are these little facts inside that really reveal the truth. 58% to less than 5% from 1980 to today.
Yeah, I can't say that's surprising, to be honest. I mean, I'm sure just from a data standpoint, some of that is affected by we had 2 wars in 30 years that had drafts, right? So a bigger percent of the population were veterans. But still, there's 18 million veterans in this country right now. So among adults, that's almost 10% of the country that are veterans. And they're clearly underrepresented by about half, by about 50%, according to your data. That's fucked up. Because not only these people highly motivated and are highly ethical and community based, they're also very motivated people. So the fact that they're not reaching this level, it speaks to that is the symptom, right? It's not that veterans are fucked up. It's that the system is such that people that feel that way, that think that way, can't get ahead in those scenarios. And that should be a huge red flag for everyone. That people that are based in ethics and doing the right thing for everybody around them can't succeed in the corporate world. I mean, they can, right? But not to the top level that we're talking about.
Well, and this goes to 2 things. I mean, first of all, you made a point earlier when you were talking about the GI Bill. It's universality,
yep.
meaning that it theoretically was accessible to everybody. And benefits that are universal are much better received than those that are means tested. Right. Now, what happened when we went from, having 2 world wars and a draft to an all volunteer military? Part of what that means, to the second point, is we've talked about the parallel reality of the aristocracy. In that aristocracy, nobody goes into the military. I got news for you, man. Nobody. Very rarely do people from that world go into the military.
Which is weird because we come from Europe, right? Primarily. Yep. Our system of laws and a lot of our culture comes from Europe. And in Europe, I mean, look at the British royal family. It's compulsory to serve in the military at some point, right? But that is not the case here. I mean, you see more veterans enter politics now, I guess, than they did 15 years ago or 20 years ago, maybe. But that's a relatively new thing. And the children of wealthy people, I mean, it's Fortunate Son, right? Creedence wrote a song about this. I don't need to rehash all this shit. You're absolutely right on that. I mean, they don't. It's funny how the wealthier people get, the more they feel like they need to be involved in some cause, but that cause never really comes down to the level of actual sacrifice. You know what I mean?
No, you're never going to feel it. What's interesting is, growing up, my parents, we were, I don't want to misrepresent, we were not poor. We were middle class. We were like working middle class. And, my mom every Sunday would write a check to the church that she'd put in the offering basket. And she would do, she'd get involved in different nonprofit things. And she'd do it to the point where where it sort of stung a little. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like it stings a little.
It needs to hurt a little bit.
It hurts a little bit. Like I know my dad, was just like, with her putting that check in the offering box every Sunday. I know it stung a little bit. He was married to her, and that's the price of being married to Becky, right?
Yeah.
But in this parallel universe of the American aristocracy, nothing stings. Like they're never going to. It's more social. It's like it's a kind of credentialing and social standing thing. Very rarely does it ever sting. I mean, I was struck by Jeff Bezos' ex-wife. Has been very aggressive giving money away. Mm-hmm. So she divorced Jeff Bezos. She gets a shit ton of money.
About $70 billion, right? Give or take.
Some insane amount.
Yeah.
And she just starts sending checks out. Mm-hmm. Boom, 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 boom. And I read something that said in 2020, despite her giving away billions of dollars of her money, she finished the year richer than she started.
Yeah. I mean, capital makes capital, right? So
yep.
I think that's one of the interesting, and we'll get to this in a minute about the social contract, what that means, what it used to mean, what it means now, and what it needs to mean in the future. But I think part of that social contract has to include some sacrifice, whatever it happens to be. Like if the reality is that capital makes capital, and I think most people, unless you're fucking delusional, would agree that that is the case, right? So how do I use that principle to benefit people? Instead of putting black people in urban environments on welfare for 40 years and creating generational poverty out of it, how do I turn this universal principle, capital creates capital, and use that to fucking give upward mobility to people that need it? You know what I mean? Because in my opinion, the only color that really matters is green in this country. I say that shit all the time. If you're a rich black person, you never dealt with any of this horse shit. You might deal with some random hillbilly saying some racist shit from time to time, but you don't deal with the institutional shit that the average black person in an urban environment does. So wealth creates a lot of fucking flexibility in your life, and it shields you from a lot of stuff as well. I wonder how we can use that, what I consider to be a universal economic principle, that capital creates capital, and turn that into something that can be useful for other people.
So I've got an idea about this, and it is more employee ownership. I'm a big, like you were giving the example of Bill Foley and Fidelity, and providing access to equity, ownership in the company to your employees. Now, Silicon Valley, which I can very frequently be critical of, the one thing Silicon Valley did absolutely right. Why do people fly from all over the world and converge on Silicon Valley when they can be developing software anywhere?
Right.
Well, one of the big reasons is you can get really, really fucking rich. And the reason you get really rich working in Silicon Valley is not because of your high salary. It's because there's a culture in Silicon Valley where people get options. They get stock in the company. And it works.
It absolutely works. Yeah, you were talking about I think you were on Andrew Yang's show not too long ago. You were talking about Bezos, and the same would apply to Musk. People think that you see these headlines like Elon Musk now worth $250 billion or whatever. It's not like he's got $250 billion in a vault and he's diving into it like Scrooge McDuck or some shit. You know what I mean? It is the equity that he owns in various companies has increased in market share or in price. That's what's happened, right? It's real money for sure. It's valuable, but it's not. That's how that capital is created, and
that's how real wealth is created.
Correct. Yeah.
That's how people get rich.
Yes.
It's because
like truly
they're
rich. Yeah.
Truly rich, like big rich. So, and here's the whole thing: is like Silicon Valley. There are all these fancy names. There's the Mark Zuckerbergs. They're the founders of Google. There are all these dudes, but there are also tens of thousands, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands of other people who have become millionaires. Because when you start these companies, or even when you enter these companies now, you get equity. And so, you not just to sort of identify problems, but to also identify some solutions. Part of how I think, there are lots of ways in which I think our capitalism can work better. But one of the ways I really believe capitalism can work better is to give employees a stake in the company.
Yeah, isn't that anti-communism? Isn't that exactly what that is? Like, why isn't that part of the American capitalist experience? Since we're so anti-red, why isn't part of it that corporations, not because the government told them to, but because it makes everything better, instead of being a shareholder-based capitalist, be a stakeholder-based capitalist? It doesn't make sense to me. It does. It's greed, right? But
we need to talk about this, Dan. This is like, we got to get these ideas out there, because look, the Silicon Valley companies didn't put this in place because they're good people. Like, they're as greedy as anybody else, but they created this system where their employees can grow rich. Why did they create that system?
Because they're not stupid. Basically.
Exactly.
The same reason they gave them cafeterias and healthcare and childcare at work on premises, like Google and Facebook has done, and all this other stuff. It makes sense. Happier workers work harder. People that are invested in things work harder. It's the fucking Ikea effect. I mean, we see it in productizing too. If you give somebody something that's 80% complete, they complete the other 20%. They feel ownership in that product, and the same thing happens in the workplace, right?
So this is what I think. This is a concrete thing we can do to make our capitalism work better, and this is real capitalism, right? Like, this is the truest form of capitalism. And part of what's fucked up in the United States right now is our capitalism is also distorted in a way, and you've talked a little bit about this, where when you do this, it also creates more competition in the workforce, and a business sector without competition isn't real capitalism. So now that we have almost a more oligarchical and more monopolistic form of capitalism in the United States too, it distorts capitalism as well. So these ideas are really going to the truest and strongest form of American capitalism. And we're an individualistic country. So I also think it matches our sort of cultural character as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of your ideas, and I don't mean to accuse you of plagiarism or anything, but Julius Caesar had this idea of bringing plebs into the Roman Senate, right? because he wanted people to be invested. Well, first of all, he wanted to be a hero to the plebs, obviously, because he was the People's Tribune and blah, blah, blah. But also just because his greed and ego intersected with what was best for society, at least in his opinion. And I think Augustus did the same. I mean, his rule is pretty good. This idea you have of putting common workers or whatever you would call them on the boards of companies, right, is a very fucking good idea. I think that
Thank you.
I really enjoy that. I mean, I think it's the natural evolution of the worker equity theory, right, which is when new profits come in, employees should see some benefit from that, honestly. And when, like you made the point before, that it used to be when a company started doing poorly, their first inclination wasn't just to fire everybody. It was to like, hey, we need to figure this out together because we're a fucking community. And maybe that was the case when it was a textile mill in fucking South Carolina somewhere, and the entire community existed only because of that mill. You know what I mean? So people had to think that way. I don't know, but either way, we've completely abandoned that. The first thing that happens in shareholder economies is that the workers suffer if things go wrong, right? Which is stupid because the workers usually, I mean, this is anti-Henry Ford. The workers are the people that buy your fucking product. He wasn't a great guy either. He was a kind of a piece of shit. But he knew if he made the cars too expensive, his workers wouldn't be able to buy them and they wouldn't care to make them.
No, that's right. Fordist wages. Yeah. Fordist wages. Yep. No, and look, it's a weird thing too, because these boards, so I sit on boards of directors of companies, and when you get boards of people who are just sort of the rich owners of the company, those are less effective boards than people who are working on the line or who are delivering the product and putting it on a shelf. Like it creates a better product. But part of this goes to, again, you brought it up at the beginning of our discussion, the aristocracy. And so these aristocrats want to be at tables with other aristocrats. They oftentimes don't want to have the very difficult, very real conversations with people who know the real deal behind things. And are not just going to blow smoke up each other's ass with a bunch of, self-congratulatory nonsense. So there's a cultural dimension to this too. Like there's people, the aristocratic class want to be around their own kind because they're also sort of hooking each other up with the very best deals behind all of it.
Right, of course.
At the expense of the workers. So it's an interesting,
I agree with that. Even when it's not, people ask me about that and they're like, do you really think there's some cabal of people talking behind the scenes? I'm like, that isn't even necessary for this shit to occur. And an unspoken understanding, a fucking handshake and a wink is enough. Be like, hey, it's us versus them, right? Cool. All right, got it. You've had those unspoken, 85% of communication is nonverbal. So we expect people to be having secret meetings to achieve all this shit? No, of course it's not happening that way. And this is the ultimate, I think, violation of what we consider to be the social contract, right? And that's something you speak about a lot as well. I want you to tell our audience from your perspective what the social contract is, what it should be rather, right? How it started in America, what it means to you.
Sure. So the social contract, it's the relationship between citizens, government, and businesses. And when a social contract works well, what it means is that businesses are out there free to build products and make money, but they are regulated to the degree that's necessary by government, and the people pick the government. And it's sort of an equilibrium. It all works well. Everybody sort of rises together. But the social contract, I would argue, has really broken in the United States in the last 30, 40 years, where, going back to the earlier part of our conversation, government has in many respects stopped doing its job. And we are now more governed by companies than we are by countries. Like, I don't know about you, but my family is much more governed by the CEOs of the 10 biggest companies in America than they are by, the presidents and prime ministers of the world's 10 biggest countries.
Right.
Whether it's, pick a topic, it's the terms of service that you check a box on that has more to do with your behavior than anything that involved democratic consent.
Right.
So the social contract is that all of us, business is free to make money, government is free to govern, but at the end of the day, citizens through democracy are really the ones setting the rules of the road, and it all works together. But it seems like, going to the title of my book, The Raging 2020s, it seems like things are sort of raging right now and are out of balance.
Right. Do you think some of this might be that the social contract as we see it, and maybe even democracy, isn't scalable at this level? I mean, people become so disparate in their not just their political beliefs, but their day-to-day life experiences, that one set of rules like that becomes very hard to govern. If the rules are too complicated, if the rules are simply, we're going to collect a certain amount of money for roads and common defense and healthcare and shit, that's pretty simple, but that's not the reality of the situation, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, authoritarian government is much more efficient than democracy.
Certainly.
And there's a reason why, when things are raging, authoritarians become more popular. You look at Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Xi Jinping in China, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin in Russia. Like, there's this movement right now towards the sort of strongman authoritarian who's like, you know what, the world's messy, and I'm gonna put this shit in order.
Yeah, I think our audience would agree that a vaccine mandate probably falls into that category, to be honest. I mean, I don't think most people on the conservative side would ever have considered themselves anti-vax at any point, right? Until somebody came to their door and started knocking on it and said, "Hey, you're fired if you don't do this." And I think that's...
I don't understand. I mean, look, just 2 seconds on this. The one thing that does disappoint me is that the United States has managed to turn this pandemic into something political in a way that we haven't come together, and that's really dismointed me.
Well, I mean,
I'll just leave that there.
It shouldn't be that surprising, though. I mean, out of the top 10 companies that Congress invests in, this is something I alluded to earlier, 3 of them are Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, and number 2 on the list is Pfizer, I believe, or number 6. They're somewhere in that range. So, I think that presents an issue. My personal opinion is that members of Congress should not be allowed to invest in anything, right?
I agree. I don't get it. I actually don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't get it at all. I mean,
I'm not sure if, by the way, before we forget about this, I'm not sure if you've seen Russell Brand's bit on all the insider trading that happens in Congress. It's like 11 minutes on YouTube. Go watch it sometime. It'll piss you off if you haven't seen it.
I haven't seen it, but I've been pissed off. Yeah. I mean, even on this COVID stuff, like members of Congress getting classified briefings, they get their classified briefings, and then they call their brokers and they start selling this. Hey, buy Netflix and Moderna and sell all this other, like, I don't understand how that's legal.
I don't either.
And here's the problem. The problem is, in order for that to become illegal, you know who has to change the law?
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
the people who are doing it.
The last constitutional amendment was about their pay, if that tells you anything, right? I wonder, so the hallmark of an actual contract is mutual consent, right? And yes. Mutual consent is something that, it's something that needs to be updated from time to time. I genuinely believe that that's what Thomas Jefferson meant when he said the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed. I don't think he meant that we need to go to fucking war every 15 years. I think he meant we need to reevaluate pretty regularly and see if these rules we've created are still good for us. It's not about whether or not the rule itself is moral. It's about whether the goddamn thing works, right? I mean, that shit drives me crazy. And I don't think there's anything closely approaching mutual consent in today's social contract in America. And I think it's interesting. I love what you said about removing the names or banning the names from your book and discussions. One of the things I would like to ask people during the election last time was, tell me in a word or in a sentence that doesn't include the words Donald or Trump, why you're voting for Biden, because I just wanted to see what people were actually thought about the guy. Like, what do you think about his record and blah, blah. I couldn't get any answers on that because you know how it is. It's just fucking polarized. Yeah. But principles, not people. We don't somehow we've bought into the aristocracy like politicians are the goddamn Kardashians or something, you know what I mean? And you pick a side and that's the side you defend. That doesn't make any sense. My side is fucking people in America. I want people to do well in America.
It's weird, man. When I was growing up, like, I didn't know the political affiliations of like my friends' parents.
Yeah.
No idea. Like, I don't know if my buddy's mom and dad are what they think politically, or if you're like if you're sitting in the stands of a little league game or a football game, you're not talking about fucking politics and politicians.
Yeah.
This is a recent thing we've done, and where we've become like, it's like Hutu versus Tutsi. This we have become so tribal, and this is why I refuse to use these names when I write it, because it makes us all dumber. Like, there have been many times where I'm like, sitting at a bar and you talk, whatever, you're talking to the dude beside you, just start having a conversation about things. And it's interesting if it is something on a political topic, there can be complexity, give and take.
Yeah.
You see that it's all not black and white. Hey, you're conservative, but you also believe that, this thing, which actually sounds a little bit liberal, or you're liberal, but you actually believe in certain things on personal responsibility that sound conservative. As soon as you bring Democrat or Republican or Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump or any of the rest of this into it, boom, the conversation goes to shit.
Yeah, it's really funny how that works. I mean, it's one of the reasons I promote Jordan Peterson's principle of understanding that he uses in his couples therapy. So you and I are having a debate about whatever it is, some economic policy, and we strip away any of the identity bullshit and just talk about the facts. That's the first part. The second part is you are required to explain my position back to me to my satisfaction before the conversation continues. Right, so there's no misunderstandings or any bullshit, and you strip away all the nonsense. Right, I think that's. I say this phrase on pretty much anywhere I go, actually, but primarily on this show. If somebody's trying to divide you, they are trying to conquer you. That's how that phrase works, right? So we should pay a lot more attention. And it's I don't know if you've heard this analogy before. I assume you have, about the ants in the jar, right? There's red and black ants in a jar. They will just do their thing and ignore each other for the most part because they work in communities. And if somebody comes along and shakes the jar, they will attack and kill each other because they think the other side did it. But they never stop to think about who shook the goddamn jar in the first place. And Americans need to stop talking about Republicans and Democrats and Donald Trump and Joe Biden and start talking about who the fuck is shaking my jar right now? Who's trying to make me hate that guy that I don't even know over there? And to what end are they trying to do that? I mean, it's obvious what they're trying to do. They're trying to capitalize on wealth and power. That's all it ever is. But how and why and how do you stop that? I think the social contract issue is really something that people can talk about without any kind of identities involved. Like, I don't care what gender you are, what your sexual orientation is. I don't give a fuck what your race is. I don't even care if you were born here, provided you're here legally. What do you expect out of the government, and what should the government and the community expect out of you in return for that? And how do we define those terms in a way that benefits everybody that's willing to obey the rules? I think that seems like a pretty reasonable way to go about it.
No, look, I mean, when we were talking earlier about leadership, there's not going to be an algorithm that sets all this right. I mean, nobody's going to program the software that figures this out for us. At the end of the day, in the world of all this computer code, it is going to take good old-fashioned leadership and the willingness and ability to elevate a little bit. And sort of either we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have this reconciliation, and we're going to make positive progress forward, or we're going to split apart. And, these will be the last years of an empire.
Well, I mean, look, you're going to see what the last years of an empire look like, probably, right? Which is a reassertion of authoritarianism, because I mean, it's like the harder, it's like a Chinese finger trap almost. Like the more you struggle to get out of it, the harder it tries to grip you. And because anybody that's ever given power doesn't just surrender it willingly. You know what I mean? It has to be taken back in some form or another. I don't worry so much about mass scale violence, because I don't think that people think that way, to be honest. I mean, maybe in their own head sometimes, and usually when mass scale violence happens, it's in the spur of the moment and it's not coordinated and shit like that. I mean, it's just the way mobs work. I'm not so worried about that. What I am worried about is that people have been pushed so far away from the center by the other side, whichever the other side is that they can't even fucking see it anymore. Like, that reason isn't even an option at that point. You know what I mean? You're just fighting the other side. It doesn't matter if maybe the government of fucking North Vietnam had a couple of decent points, and if you admit that, then you're a fucking anti-American now because we're fighting. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? It's this us versus them mentality. How do we? You made the point. I was going to make it, but you made it for me. Congress is the one that has to change this, at least according to our current system of government, and they're not going to do it. There's a 0% chance that that's going to happen. So how do we fucking change this?
So part of it, so let's talk about business and business accountability for a second. You said the only color that matters is green.
Yep.
So let's look at why, let's think for a second about why we've grown increasingly tribal. One of the reasons is money. There are companies that make tens of billions of dollars to divide us. This has become public. If you look at Facebook, for example, Facebook's algorithm, whether it's on the right or on the left,
it depends on what benefits them at the time. Facebook is not a liberal organization. They are a bunch of assholes, basically, right? They don't give a shit what side they're on.
And their algorithm amplifies extreme points of view.
Right.
And so literally, normal people, I go on Facebook and, if a buddy of mine from high school shares something, then maybe I'm going to look at it. But what's the invisible hand of the Facebook algorithm decides which of my buddies from high school, which one of those feeds am I going to see? Right. And we know for a fact that algorithm favors it favors division and it favors extreme views. So I do think there's a corporate responsibility to this too. And it's one of those things like taxes. We were talking about taxes earlier. It's fucking complicated, so we don't engage on it. When you start talking about algorithms, that stuff is complicated too. And so because you think if you can't code, you can't do anything about it, but you can. So I think there's a level of responsibility. I think there's a level of responsibility that government has. I think there's a level of responsibility that corporations have. But I also think there's a responsibility that we have. Unfortunately, one of the things that we've been doing lately is anybody who is in either of the political parties, this is happening with both Democrats and Republicans, anybody who is not just singing from the choir, anybody who varies even 1% from the doctrine of their political party is canceled.
Right.
They're like, they're destroyed.
Like the stuff going on with the infrastructure bill right now with Manchin and the other woman whose name I can never pronounce correctly.
Sinema.
Yeah, Sinema.
I think it's Sinema.
I think it's. Yeah. I feel like it's Sinema, and it looks like that to me. And I'm like, am I saying this wrong? I'm really paranoid about saying names wrong. Anyways, they are. Man, the leftist lights them up every single day in the media. Why aren't they fucking falling in line? What do you mean falling in line? Their job is not to represent Democrats in Congress. Their job is to represent America. You know what I mean?
And then it was the same. Look, it's the same thing. Particularly under Trump. With Ben Sass and all these other. Flake from Arizona, John McCain. Anybody who stepped outside of the this is what we're doing. Boom. You're going to get shot. And it used to be the case that those folks actually were the most important, they were actually the ones who drove the legislative process. Now, it's happening to a degree now because Congress is so easily divided, but to the responsibility we have as citizens, part of what I would say is we actually need some more independent thinkers. I mean, even you, Dan, you could categorize some of your thinking, but you're an independent thinker, and you're not going to just, you're going to go issue by issue and make up your mind. And I bet and that's actually how most people are. I bet most people who are watching us right now, issue by issue, as long as they aren't doing the lazy thing and being like, oh, well, Trump thinks this or Biden thinks this. Right. If they actually think about the issue, they're going to make up their own mind.
Well, that's almost entirely the case. I mean, abortion is an issue in every single goddamn federal election. And in exit polls, about 3% of people choose who they vote for based on that option or based on that factor. I mean, it's obvious that people don't think that way in principle, right?
No, look, this is right, and we need more independent thinkers. We need people who are willing to go issue by issue and think through them, because otherwise, again, how are we better than just two tribes? It's really unproductive. So there are responsibilities for government, responsibilities for corporations, and responsibilities that we as citizens have to do better as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. The East taught us a lot about, everybody knows Sun Tzu, but the East taught us a lot about combat. One of the things they taught us is that if you are fighting a battle you can't win, the only way to win is to not play. And You can't do that by avoiding social media. You can't avoid social media or the algorithms, especially if you're running a business in today's world. You just can't avoid it. But what you can control is that you can control how you process information. You can control that you don't see a flashy headline and just accept it as reality, because that's not how reality works. You can decide to go fact check. And I think it's most important if you do align with one side or the other, or if you go down the checklist and most of your beliefs are closer to one side or the other, it is most important to fact check yourself first and the people around you first than it is to fact check the enemy first, if you consider them the enemy, or the other side, or however you decide that. Because people I wasn't a huge fan of John McCain, because I thought, well, I have a lot of, we're not going to get into all that, but people like that don't really give a shit about the party politics stuff are super important to the process. It has to be like that. There has to be some check and balance to this conversation. Otherwise, it devolves into a shouting match. One of the metaphors I used on a show before, I believe, was like, we start out in these political conversations whispering, so we're really close to one another. We can hear each other, we can ask questions, and then we're talking out loud, and we get further apart, and then we're shouting, and we start shouting so loud, right, that we're so far apart. And now the only way we can reach each other was with projectile weapons at some point, right? It turns to war at some point, and it's just, it's an unfortunate reality. And I think it's mostly fear and cowardice. You know what I mean? People that have, want to protect what they have, even at the expense of others, and people that don't have shit, they don't really, these socialists, they don't give a shit about the poor. They hate the rich. That's it. They hate the rich. You know what I mean? And, I don't think there's anything to be learned from those people, and it's the fruition of human beings' worst nature, right? We're afraid, so we're a dog backed into a corner, and we're going to lash out at people, and it's us, them, and fuck everybody else. You know what I mean? You can't continue to live life that way. If you want America to be great, if you want to continue saying that America is a great country, the greatest country, which we're the only people that say that, we're the only people that say our country is the best in the world, then you owe it to your country to do something to make that true. I think that's my part of the. So most people, from the social contract perspective, can only control who they are as citizens. Maybe to some degree small businesses, but primarily it's how you react as a consumer in America, basically, right? You're consuming not just products, but you're also consuming liberty. Most people on earth don't have this shit. India and China, where most people live, don't have this shit. You know what I mean? So I love talking to people like you that have. It's funny. 10 years ago, somebody would be like, "Oh, that guy's he's a liberal that writes about money and tech and shit." Like, "Oh, cool. I don't need to listen to him." Like, are you fucking kidding me? That's really your attitude? So I appreciate you coming on. Tell us where you can find the book, where you can find you on social media, and so on and so forth.
No, look. I appreciate it. I appreciate this conversation. So the book, The Raging 2020s. I think you can find it everywhere. You can find it. You find it in any bookstore at this point. You can find it on Amazon. The Raging 2020s, and you can find me on social media. It's usually at Alec J. Ross. And look, I think I appreciate this conversation. And if we had more of these, and if we had more people who were thinking about these issues with fresh eyes and open minds like you, Dan, we'd be doing a lot better.
I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate you coming on today. And we always end the show by telling the audience we'll see him in hell. So we'll see you in hell.